Mark Dunning, President of AWRA. Welcome to this month's posting of Windows on Water Management, short audio interviews with leaders in water resources management that provide a window into their perspectives and practice. Today we're honored to have Dr. Jerome Delli Priscoli, an expert in water resources policy issues, with us. Jerry's impressive bio can be found in this posting. As most of you who are listening to this audio segment know, this year marks AWRA's 50th anniversary, and I've chosen to look backward at a landmark water policy that came into effect about the same time as AWRA, the 1965 Water Resources Planning Act. I've asked Dr. Delli Priscoli to provide his perspective on the significance of the Act and its relevance to water management in the past, now, and into the future. Thanks so much for being with us today, Jerry.
You're welcome, Mark. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, thanks very much for being with us. Well, we have a couple of questions that we want to launch right into. The first question that I would pose to you is, what was the 1965 Water Resources Planning Act, and why was it important?
Well, the Planning Act in 65, and especially all of the work that led up to it, and I would mean by that over 50 years of work, is really one of the seminal acts of water resources in the United States, especially in the past 20th century, right up there with the 308s and the Flood Control Acts. It essentially was an attempt to reach some kind of compromise between one of the central struggles in water policy in the U.S. That's really, how do we recognize the need to coordinate, which had evolved over time? That means coordinating between uses. And how do we do that at the same time that we plan versus operating? Because this tension between who is operating and who has authority to operate and who has authority to plan and coordinate remained a problem in the early 20th century and right into our own times now. And I think the Water Resource Planning Act tried to deal with that. It set up a Water Resources Council, which was a sub-cabinet committee which included Army, Education, Agriculture, Health. A few other cabinet offices were added, and it also had observers. Interestingly, it created 6 river basin commissions under Title II. That's something that I did a dissertation on many, many years ago. And it also authorized federal assistance to states under what was called a Title III. And it had some specific things it was supposed to do. It was supposed to do frequent assessments of the nation's water supplies. It was supposed to try and relate river basin plans to larger regional development issues. It tried to establish uniform principles and standards, in other words, analytical methods by which people would look at the projects and integrate them with other objectives. And it was supposed to make recommendations and what was called appraisals of various projects. This, in fact, was the heart of an attempt at trying to deal with this compromise of operations versus planning. It also did some minor financial grants to states. I say minor, I guess it was in the $50 to $100 million range, I'm not sure, but at any rate, grants to the states at that time. And it operated for about 16 years.
Yes.
Now,
okay, please continue.
Well, yeah, I think to understand some of this, that's sort of the descriptive part of this. Now, one really needs to look at some of the history of water policy in the U.S. Put this in a context. From the turn of the century with President Teddy Roosevelt, we began to see this awareness of the need for multiple objectives emerge. Congress asked the Corps of Engineers in the 1920s to do these 308 reports. They were reports of multiple purposes on every river in the U.S. And eventually we saw, as we moved into the Depression, the TVA emerged. Actually, Muscle Shoals development was first proposed by Henry Ford, as a private enterprise. But at any rate, the TVA emerged, which is our only case of kind of a complete river basin organization to deal with social and political and other issues through water. And a very interesting film, the Relevance film, which was a film that has become an icon in the whole business of filmmaking, with many, many famous, or people who were to become famous, of producers on that film, which looked at the problem and the plight of soil erosion and the great drought and the great migrations that occurred, and ended up with a belief in a great scientific approach to water resources, which really was the TVA. This film can be seen now. Then, with the successes of that, Franklin Roosevelt, and then his wife after his passing away, and Senator Norris from Nebraska, tried to create 7 more little TVAs. That's what they were called, 7 little TVAs in different river basins in the United States, and set up commissions to do that. They failed. The Truman Water Commission in the 1950s essentially tried to deal with this, and came up with a framework very much like what amounted in the Water Resources Planning Act in 1965. The central part of this, really, was about these authorities over planning and coordinating planning versus operation. Because if you had different authorities operating as well as planning, you would threaten some of the federal agencies, like the one you and I have worked for, Mark, Corps of Engineers, Agriculture, and others, and even the states. So there was great resistance coming from them to too much authority being given. So into this is what the Water Resource Council kind of jumped into. The Senate Select Committees in the late 50s, having all of this history in the Harvard Water Program, articulating some of this and helping them, created the Water Resources Planning Act, which had those elements that I just mentioned. But those elements weren't just dreamed up. What we're saying here is that they really emerged over a long period of time. And interestingly enough to this is that in the late 70s, when you and I both started with in this business, remember the President Carter hit list. Well, this hit list brought the Water Resource Council right into the center again of this problem of bucking up against the forces and authorities of various government agencies and states, and put it into a political fight, which is part of the reason that it got defunded, eventually defunded with the Reagan administration. Another important point to mention as we finish this question, the Water Resources Planning Act is still in the books. It's a matter of funding it, and there have been various attempts to try to refund this because many people think we need some better form of coordinating nationally.
Well, thank you for a masterful, brief history of this. It basically points out that, as you say, that the roots of this act go very deep in American history, and a lot of the conflicts, I guess, that we still are facing today can be seen in the way this law came about and was ultimately defunded. Very interesting, Jerry.
Yes, and it's something that I wish more of our people working in this business would take a little time to go back and look at, because it's highly instructive.
Yes. Well, what have been significant lasting achievements of the Act, the things that have lived on even though the law itself is currently defunded?
Well, to give you the descriptive kinds of achievements, the council was involved with 2 national water assessments. And incidentally, we haven't done another water assessment in the country since 1975, and that probably is something we need. I don't mean a national plan or even a national policy, but some form of assessments. Those assessments contain a lot of interesting information that are highly relevant to today's big debates on integrated water resource management in the world as well as in the U.S. They did somewhere around 20 or 30, I included about 25 river basin studies. These were the river basin, Title II river basin commissions. Those studies were essentially to be architectures of a river, not to dictate how they're done, but to try to build some consensus around how a river should look, and the implementation could be private, public, or any number of things. And in addition to that, they created what was called principles and standards, which are the analytical guidelines to try to integrate these different uses and different kinds of values, social values, ecological values, and others into this process of planning. Having said all that, those are tangible outcomes. But I think that this whole exercise has very much, or left very much, for us to use today as we struggle with, well, how are we going to trade off environment, economics, other social aspects? How do we relate the regional or statewide impacts and national impacts? And when you read some of these assessments and some of these reports, they are remarkably relevant to the debates in integrated water management that I see in the United Nations and other places today. So there is a great legacy that has been left. But perhaps for the United States, the largest is that this is one of our major attempts at integrating the water uses along the rivers. It was the best thinking at the time of the academic and the professional world. I think it brought really a recognition of multiple disciplines into the water business. You and I are social scientists and beyond just economics, and it brought that into the whole business of water planning. It brought other natural sciences, and it institutionalized their participation far beyond the existence of this act. It also institutionalized something dear to my heart and yours, Mark, because we work together, and that's public participation in water resource planning. That means participation in the administrative processes, not just the legislative processes. And it had a tremendous impact on what has occurred in the last 50 years and beyond the Act itself. And it began to give some process to us about giving weight in the planning process to environment, along with other economic benefits. Most important, perhaps, to the professionals in the community, it left us with some important tools we call principles and standards, now principles and guidance, but it was a serious attempt at looking at national accounting of benefits, environmental, social, and economic. And you know, when you look at the debates today in the world, in the UN and other places, that's exactly what they're looking at. How do we trade these things off? How do we measure them? And how do we compare them? So the list of achievements is quite large and I think quite valuable for us.
Yes, certainly. I mean, as you recount them, it's easy to see that a lot of the things that we take for granted or grapple with in our own professional practices, trading off and evaluating disparate benefits and costs, can be found in this law the way that it was cast. So, thinking right now, currently, what lessons learned should we take from the Act that would apply to contemporary water resources management?
Well, you laugh at my first answer to this. Water's political, no big surprise, correct?
Right.
But I really, seriously, what that means to me is that the messages of trying to integrate, today we use the word AWRA, Integrated Water Resources Management. The messages of integration, even when we speak of them in purely technical terms, are really messages of distribution and redistribution of political power. They're not purely technical. And that is the way those whom we're advising see it. And we need to remember that. In our system, federal system that we have in the United States, the nature of that federalism, meaning the nature of the political power relations between states and federal governments, is constantly changing. In fact, we've had different types of mechanisms to manage the tensions I mentioned earlier based on what that relationship happens to be at certain times. So what the Act represents and reminds us about is that we must have serious systems of managing that tension between the political and technical, of which this act was one. And this is highly relevant to today's world. The timing of the act was a little unlucky. I would agree with many of my colleagues. I mean, it came in what was perceived to be at the end of this big water infrastructure era in the United States, almost as if we've invested, now we don't have to invest anymore in the infrastructure. Of course, we know that's not true, but that's the impression because a new set of values emerged of environmental concerns. And then we had the hit list from the President Carter, that was, for a variety of reasons, that gained a lot of credence. And we had the reorganizations of the Reagan administration and this new federalism, or views, again, of federal-state relations, which put far more emphasis on states and brought more cost-sharing in, and the defunding occurred. But that, in a sense, was unlucky timing in many ways, and I don't think it takes away from the lesson I just mentioned. I also think that these national assessments need to be looked at again. In fact, I think the U.S. needs to do it and find a way to do it. Again, it's not a national plan or national policy, but some form of assessment, because we have such a great change in the demographics in the country, which means that the demand curves for water change because they're driven by new values. And we face the issues of how do we redistribute water, even with the current infrastructure, and how do we do this in a way that makes sense and has some sense of fairness and equity to them. And also the history and the debates that were contained in this act and what created the act, the frameworks, the trade-offs, and the solutions have great relevance, as I said, to the outside world and to us. And I think that maybe, just maybe, if we were to use some of this and some of the fora that we go off forward in the world, it may come back to the U.S. and encourage some of our own people to look at this history and to read some of this and to maybe even use some of its frameworks as guidelines to how we may look at it today.
Yes. Yes, great, Jerry. That really helps apply it, I think, influence our thinking about how this act still is very relevant in terms of its concepts and in helping to address some of the needs that we still have today.
Mark, I would add something in that. Your comment made me think of something else. One of the remarkable parts of this act and its creation was the collaborations among some of the best thinking in the academic world, professional world, and the practical political world at the time. I haven't seen such collaboration since, and I had the opportunity to spend quite a bit of time, as you know, doing a dissertation on something like this. You obviously dig into a lot. But the collaboration among people who are really concerned about water resources from these different perspectives and also many different disciplines has not really been duplicated. And I think part of the reason is the focus was on the water resources, the large, French say, the large cycle. Because one of the things that happened when we got focused on environment was we got more and more focused on the small cycle, meaning water supply, sanitation, which has technology and has infrastructure. But it isn't looking at, say, the whole river or the whole larger cycle of water. And looking at that larger cycle forces this kind of collaboration. And the history of that collaboration was quite remarkable. It had the best of thinking that we had in this country at that time. And we'd love to recover it, I think.
As you've been talking about this act and its history and all the significant achievements, I was thinking about the parallel with AWRA. AWRA was formed about the same time that the act came into law, with pretty much the same kind of ethos: integrated resource management, collaboration, multidisciplinary focus. And it's interesting that while the act has been defunded, many of the concepts find their way into integrated water resources management, which of course is AWRA's primary orientation as we have practiced it over the last 50 years and as we go forward into the future. This is sort of an interesting parallel that I think is very relevant to our thinking at AWRA.
I agree with that completely, and I don't know enough of the history of AWRA, but I suspect its birth at this particular time was part of that syndrome, a positive syndrome I was reflecting on among the different disciplines and concerns in the country.
Right, right. Well, I think we've used up most of our time, so I want to close this out by saying, first of all, thank you so much for being with us today, Jerry. I think our listeners have benefited greatly from your insights about this important piece of legislation. So thank you very much.
Well, you're welcome, and it's an honor to do that. It's great to be with you again. We spent so many years together, and I'm a great fan of AWRA and its attempt at trying to integrate disciplines around water resources.
Great. Well, thanks again, and thanks to everyone who's listened in today for being with us on Windows on Water Management. Watch this space for more interviews with leaders in water resources management in the coming months. Until next time, this is Mark Dunning signing off.
Perfect.
Oh. Okay, how do